All right. Welcome, everybody, to Finance Essentials with Danny Hudson. I am your host, Danny Hudson, and we are back from vacation. We got a chance to go down to Florida last week. It was actually, I guess, the was that 2 weeks before the July 4th weekend, so we beat all the crowds. Although I guess in Florida these days there's no such thing as beating the crowds because everyone is vacationing in Florida, which I guess isn't a bad thing, right? I mean, that's part of the reward of not locking down and saying, hey, come to Florida where we're open and you guys can live a normal life, which was great. I will say we were there for what five? We were there for like 5 or 6 days, and one of the things that I did not hear, not a single time while we were down there, the Delta variant. Who cares, right? And so I did not have to listen to anything about the Delta variant of COVID the entire time that we were there, and it was beautiful. We got to go out to eat. Now, one of the drawbacks is we didn't get a chance to go out to eat with a wait that was less than an hour. But hey, when you really want crab claws, you do what you got to do. But so we're back. We're gonna do a show. This episode, I'm super excited about because it was kind of one of those rabbit hole episodes where you start reading and you think you're going to do one thing one way, but then it turns out that it goes kind of in a completely opposite direction, and then you learn about all kinds of stuff as it comes along. So I'm super excited about that, and hopefully some of it'll be a bit new for you guys as well. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you guys all for listening. I love doing the show. I love communicating with you guys. I love getting feedback. So it's been wonderful, and thank you guys for tuning in. Obviously, if you get some value out of it, hit subscribe, hit like, hit share. Do all that kind of fun stuff, right? Because I rely on you guys to kind of keep the show going. I would probably do it anyway, because again, especially on an episode like today where I learned some things. I'd probably kind of do it anyway, but obviously I think the message is good enough to where the other people should be able to enjoy it as well. So one of the things that's going on in the news these days, and what we're going to do this episode about, is the recent infrastructure bill that ended up passing. Right? We did an episode prior on what the proposed $2 trillion bill was, where we broke it all down and all the categories, and right, that was when the tweet came out that talked about how what was it, childcare is infrastructure, right? Which I'm sure some of us might go along with, but the rest of us look at that and go, that's kind of nonsense. So we already did an episode that was breaking that down, but this one that has actually moved through move through some legislation while they're waiting to kind of pass it. And it was not $2 trillion. This one came in to be about $760 billion, which, let's be honest, 760 billion, 1.2 trillion, 2 trillion, it's all the same, right? I mean, like we've talked about on this show in the past, the number itself is almost impossible to conceptualize. Right? I mean, it's just an ungodly amount of money. And the big thing too is, the way the negotiations normally start when it comes to this kind of thing, and this is how that everybody in DC is kind of playing for the same team, right? No, well, not everybody. Most people in DC are playing for the same team, and the team is special interest or campaign finance. How do we get more money so I can get reelected? And I think Michael Malice actually explains this the best way. And I don't know if he came up with this saying or if he got it from somebody else, but he basically says that conservatives, or maybe it's Republicans, are Democrats driving the speed limit. So you look at platforms, right? And you look at what's agreed upon and what's discussed and what's negotiated, that the current Republican platform would be comparable to the Democratic platform from 10 years ago, whatever it might be. So in this instance, when we're talking about infrastructure, the Democrats will come out and they'll say, well, we need $2 trillion because we need to cover everything, right? We need to give Amtrak $100 billion, and we need to give home nurses $500 billion. I mean, I'm making that number up, but what they'll do is they will start at a super high number, and then, the Republicans will go, well, that number is a little high. Of course it is. It's $2 trillion high. Your starting point should be zero, right? Because the real answer of it is zero. And so what they'll do is that the one side will start at this super high level, and then the other side will go, well, I don't know about that. We're not going to be on board, because they have to kind of save face for some of their constituents, right? They have to prove that they're kind of not complete losers, and so that, you know what? That's not too harsh. I'm going to stick with that. They have to show that they're not complete losers, that they can win somewhere. And so their win will be, well, we didn't negotiate $2 trillion because that's too much money. So we're going to agree to this $760 billion because we're looking out for the American people, right? They care about you, which again is hogwash, right? No, I don't think at this point most people believe that. But again, so where the starting point was zero, it's like negotiations, right? When it comes to salary negotiations at a job, and someone's like, well, how much money would you like to get paid? And you just throw out an obscene number, and in the hopes that it'll, even though your real number that you're hoping for might be significantly less, you just throw out a huge number in hopes that they'll get like somewhat close to it. And so that's kind of how this ends up working out. But so I pulled this from the Washington Post, and it was titled House passes $760 billion transportation water bill, making its pitch on infrastructure. And so, excuse me. So where this breakdown is and I'll compare it a little bit to the $2 trillion bill that we reviewed last time, just to see a little bit of the contrast. Now, obviously, this is less than half of what the $2 trillion one was, so there was a significant amount that was cut. But some of these are comparable, and it might not be a perfect apples to apples comparison, but it's probably going to include some of the same things, or most of the same things. So in this one, there's about $343 billion for roads, bridges, and safety programs. Now, if you did listen to the episode about the $2 trillion one, only like $115 billion was actually allocated for roads and bridges and so on and so forth. So a very small percentage of the total $2 trillion was actually for what I would consider infrastructure. So this one's up significantly there. Another $110 billion for transit agencies, and in the $2 trillion bill, it was about $85 billion, about $95 billion for rail, which again, those Amtrak guys, man, they know how to negotiate, right? Because it is a completely worthless, always losing money platform, and they are just getting tens of billions of dollars, which is crazy. And so then in the $2 trillion bill, that was $80 billion. And then there's also $117 billion for drinking water programs, $51 billion for wastewater infrastructure, and then for water infrastructure, the last one was about $110 billion, so that one's also a bit higher. And then $45 billion to replace all lead water lines. And then this one I thought was very interesting, is that there is $30 billion to develop high-speed rail projects. Now, when I read something like that, I immediately think, and maybe you do too, but I immediately think that is $30 billion of people who have connections in the government, right, that are going to claim, hey, we're working on a high-speed rail project. We need $700 million. And they're going to go, well, why not? We have $30 billion allocated for this. Let's go for it. And to provide a little bit of context, California was attempting to build a high-speed rail that went from Northern California to Southern California, which makes sense in California because their priorities are spot on, right? They don't really care about the fact that people are leaving in droves, and they don't care about the fact that, Los Angeles was the most hardest hit small business during the lockdown. They don't care about stuff like that, right? What they care about is ridiculous port projects like $100 billion light rail, which of course it doesn't go anywhere and it's not effective. No one is actually going to be able to ride on it. They shrank it. It's not going from Northern California to Southern California. And of course, it's way over budget and completely worthless. And so $30 billion to develop high-speed rail projects. They're not building a lot of high-speed rail for $30 billion. These are just going to be for projects. So if you happen to work in that industry, pitch your idea. You might get a ton of money. You might get a ton of money from the federal government for this. And so that's kind of an overall breakdown as far as what that $760 billion was. But there was one part of this article that really stood out to me, and it was kind of touching on an issue, and I'll get into it a little bit further in the show, but it touched on an issue that I've read a little bit about in the past, and I know a little bit about it, but I really wanted to explore it. And of course, it was completely glossed over by the author of the article. But it said that it would require. So this is thinking about the infrastructure bill here. Is that it would require states to consider alternatives such as transit before widening highways, and provides $14.5 billion for projects that would reduce carbon emissions or make transportation networks more resistant to extreme weather. Now, obviously, we've got some extreme weather and things like that going on, but the part of that is very interesting is that it would require states to consider alternatives such as transit before widening highways. So what this is saying to me is that all of this funding is conditional on the states complying with whatever regulations that the federal government wants to throw in there, which to me immediately throws up red flags, right? And so, like I said, I'm going to touch onto this a little bit later, and this is the part where we really started to go down the rabbit hole, because there was another article that I came across that talks about this infrastructure bill that I thought was very surprising, and it goes into discussing about how, well, I'll just read it. This one actually came from CNBC, and the title of it was Biden's infrastructure plan would cut U.S. debt and slightly increase economic growth. Wharton study finds. Now, if you're not familiar with Wharton, that is the prestigious business school at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, if you care about, the Ivy Leagues and excuse me, if you care about the Ivy Leagues and all that kind of stuff, Wharton is basically the top dog. And so this is essentially the top business school, the top intellectual school in the country when it comes to business, that is telling you a bald-faced lie. It is a lie, and I'll tell you why. As we go into it, but there is no way that it is going to cut U.S. debt. It's not going to happen, right? We all know it's not going to happen. These are funny words that they say to where people will look at it and they'll go into it and they'll go, oh yeah, well no, that's great. It's actually going to cut the debt. That's how we can throw trillions of dollars at this, because it's going to stimulate economic activity and so on and so forth. So reading a little bit more into this, they said that researchers at the Wharton School said additional, $600 billion in infrastructure would increase domestic output by 0.1% and increase the U.S. debt by 0.9% by, and I'll let you guess, what year do you believe that they said that this will happen by? I'll give you like 2 seconds. 2050. Now, if you guess 2050, let me know, and I don't know, I'll buy you a beer or something like that. So basically, they're saying in 30 years that this is going to cut the U.S. debt, right? And if you've been listening to the show and you've been following along with the show, then you will understand why they have these far out time frames, right? Because when they don't hit them, they can blame whatever else, right? Because Biden is not going to be the president for 30 years. Personally, I don't think he's even going to make it another 3.5 years. But so, so policy is going to change, right? Things are going to change in terms of the government and whatever else is going to happen. And they're going to spend way more money than they say they are. So they won't hit that target, but they're going to say it. And that's supposed to help drum up support, right? And so what they said is that over time, as the new spending declines, IRS enforcement continues and revenue grows from higher output, the government debt declines relative to baseline by 0.4% and 0.9% in 2040 and 2050 respectively, which is insane, right? I mean, I don't think outside of the intellectual circles that anybody is really going to buy that. But again, they will use it to help drum up support. Now, to give Wharton some credit, to essentially say they aren't necessarily just towing, the party line here. They did also review the $2 trillion one that was from several months ago, and they actually said that it was actually going to decrease the economic output by about 0.8%. In 2050. So same time frame, the $2 trillion one was actually going to decrease economic output by 0.8% in 2050. Again, they're using a time frame, right, where no one is going to hold them to this. There will not be any accountability. There won't be any measurements. There won't be anything that will actually tie them to any of these numbers by 2050. So I thought it was very interesting that there are groups of people. Now keep in mind too, one of the things we also talked about in the episode about the $2 trillion infrastructure plan is there was no discussions as far as how they were going to fund this, right? At least in that episode, they talked about a mileage tax, and we talked about how mileage taxes hurt the poor. Well, they're not even talking about funding in this one, because at this point, if you've been listening and you've been following to the show, we understand how they're going to fund it. They're going to print the money. It's just going to get printed up, and they'll just throw that money out there, and they'll bump it into this infrastructure, which is essentially a jobs program, right? There's nothing really about this other than they believe that they should print this money up, and they're going to pay for all of this stuff. And then what they're going to do is they're going to get more people who are going to be dependent and reliant upon government money to continue to maintain their lifestyle, and that therefore they will be dependent upon the government, and they're more likely to support more funding and more of these types of programs. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to circle back to that point that I had discussed and talked about earlier, as far as the funding that the federal government will use to hold over the state's head, right? This is basically money that is saying, we are going to give this money to you. Here are the conditions that you have to meet to be able to get that money. Because if you remember correctly, well, I don't know if we've talked about it, but if you think about it, and you think about funding, right, to the states do not have the ability to be able to print money the way that the federal government does. And so states, generally speaking, are required to kind of have a balanced budget. Now, whether or not they do it, it's hard to say. I don't know the details as far as who balances budgets, who has surpluses, who doesn't. I know we did talk about how California is actually going to have a budget surplus, basically because Silicon Valley is paying it with capital gains taxes, and they're using their capital gains taxes to basically fund the entire budget of the state of California. So a lot of states may have surpluses, but not all of them. But they don't have the ability to be able to go, wow, we're about $3 trillion short. Let's get old Federal Reserve over there and Mr. Powell to hit that Control P button and print us up, another $3 or $4 trillion. So when this money is actually given out by the federal government, the states will use it as part of their budget, right? And so I wanted to know, and again, this is the way that my brain works is that I want to know how much money for state budgets are reliant upon federal money, right? Because the more money that a state is getting from the federal government, the more likely they are to comply with all of these restrictions and all of these requirements, because their budget is essentially reliant on it. And so I think that that would be very important to know. Well, I found a report from the Heritage Foundation. Now, it's kind of old. It was from 2008. But what they talked about was, now keep in mind, this is 2008, is that, so it's most likely not lower than this. There's a good chance that it's higher, but I guess it could be lower. I mean, there was one period of time where it did actually go down, but generally speaking, it's gone up. But in 2008, federal aid to states and state matching funds accounted for 45% of state spending. So that was what, 13 years ago. And so what that means is, when they're talking about the matching funds, Medicaid is a very good example of this, right? Is that it's not money coming specifically from the federal government, but the federal government is basically requiring the states to raise X amount of dollars on your own to get Y dollars from the federal government. So if you think about it like in terms of in terms of Medicaid, if they are going to have in their budget $100 Medicaid dollars, the federal government is saying, well, we will give you $56 of Medicaid, but you have to raise and tax your own people to the $44, right? You can't, that is the requirement. You can't raise $10 and then we're going to give you this money. You have to raise 44 and then we will give you 56. So it's already some leverage that they have there, because they're basically saying you have to raise this money from your own people to be able to have access to this money. Now, one of the parts that I thought was very interesting is that 45% seems very high, but I don't really have any context. Maybe that's low. Now, again, knowing government like we do, and if you've been listening to the show, hopefully you're asking these types of questions more than you were than before you started listening to this show, because these questions are very important, right? This is all relevant for you, and it's all relevant for me, and it's all relevant for our families, because all of this is essentially a way not to operate a budget, right? It's very difficult to be able to operate, mainly because you and I, we don't have a printing press, right? We can't just inflate away our problems. And so by being able to see these types of deficiencies and ineptitude by these government bureaucracies, hopefully it provides some insight into what you need to do and what I need to do and we as a community need to do to make sure that we are shielded from, all of these deficiencies to where we are not going to become reliant upon them. So to give a little bit of context as far as the federal funding to the states, in 1929, federal aid to states accounted for 2%. 2%. Now, again, we're talking about a pretty wide time frame here. What is that? Almost 80 years. But it went from 2% to 45%. Now, you may also be thinking about this in terms of, well, let's see. Even our state governments, they spend more money every year. And our taxes don't always necessarily go up. And so if they're going to spend more money every year, but your taxes don't necessarily go up, where's that money going to come from? Because as we've already talked about, right, the states don't have a printing press. They don't have the ability to be able to make money out of thin air and just go, whoop, ta-da, our budget is balanced. So what they're going to do is they're going to become, just like we talked about on last week's episode, or I guess maybe it was 2 weeks ago now. But just like we talked about on the last episode, they have become dependent, or they will become more dependent upon that federal money. And therefore, they are more likely to comply with the Beltway's restrictions. And so I thought that was very interesting that over the span of that time frame that the states have become more and more reliant to the tune of 2% all the way up to 45%. Now, I have heard other things about federal funding and tying it over. The big things, at least that I had known about, generally tend to relate to like sin taxes. So things like alcohol, that they are basically being forced by the federal government to meet certain regulations to be able to get certain types of funds. Now, I didn't know some of the additional details about that, but ta-da! I found a perfect article from The Atlantic that was titled "4 Times the Government Held Highway Funding Hostage," which I'm thinking, perfect. That is exactly what I'm looking for. And so what I wanted to read was I learned there was something called a highway trust fund. And so what a highway trust fund, I guess it's probably more of like a compliance fund, right? The federal government dumps a bunch of money into it, and then they go to the states and they go, hey, look at all this money that we got. Guess what? We've got some more instructions for you guys we got some more instructions here for you guys to listen. And if you don't listen, then, oh man, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to have access to all this money that we have. And so how they divvy that out is related to laws and regulations that are passed down from the federal government. So the big one that most people might think about is like driving laws. So for example, if you guys are familiar with the Autobahn, right? The Autobahn in Germany, where there's not a posted speed limit in the vast majority of it, and so cars can essentially drive as as fast as they would like. Well, when I was a kid, I used to remember people talking about that about Montana, right? That there were stretches of highway in Montana that didn't have speed limits. Thought maybe it was an urban legend or something like that, but there ended up being a speed limit that was attached to those highways in Montana, and part of it was due to the Highway Trust Fund. They basically withheld funding from Montana until they instituted a speed limit. And so one of the things that's very interesting is that that is how they kind of regulate interstate commerce, is that they will threaten to withhold that federal money from highway infrastructure if they don't apply. So the speed limit in Montana was one, and this one I thought was very interesting because if you're about my age, then it's probably our parents. If you're a bit younger than me, maybe it's your grandparents, but you hear them tell stories about when they were in high school and they were drinking beer, or they were at a bar, or they went down to the store to pick up a 6-pack, or alcohol basically, when they were in high school, 18, 17, whatever. Now, sometimes it was because, well, they just didn't check IDs. Well, not exactly. That's not exactly what it was. Coming back to the Highway Trust Fund, there was in 1984, the Highway Trust Fund was used to actually get states to comply with a national drinking age of 21. Now, states that did not comply with this, and this was during the Reagan age, right? So the Reagan administration. So the Reagan administration was basically saying, we are going to make this 21 drinking age limit federal. Now, you do not have to comply, but if you do not comply, we are going to cut 10% of your federal highway funds. So it's kind of like whenever people are like, oh, hey, how did you end up in this? How'd you get assigned to that project? And then you think, well, I didn't really volunteer. I was kind of voluntold, right? Everybody kind of uses the term voluntold. So it worked out that way as far as the driving age. And so basically all of the states, not all at the same time, but all of the states ended up complying with this new rule, so that way they didn't lose their federal funds. And now because of it, the U.S. has the highest minimum drinking age in the entire world, right? We can literally ask people to go off and fight in these insane wars. Well, I don't need to make that comparison. You guys already know about that. But yeah, so because of this Highway Trust Fund, all of the states ended up increasing their drinking age up to 2021. Now, another one, and this one is probably one, it makes me angry. It makes me angry. But there was another example that was back in 1974, and now keep in mind this is when President Nixon's around. Now, if you're not too familiar with the 70s, it was a pretty crazy time. High inflation, oil embargo, so gas prices were crazy. So there were gas shortages, things along those lines. So President Nixon and Congress set the national speed limit at 55 miles per hour. 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. Now, if you're like me and you get out there on the highway, and if I'm on the highway and I can only do 55 miles per hour, I am going crazy. I'm losing my mind because I'm like, let all the slow people get over. I want to go faster. And so that was an introduction of a speed limit of 55 nationally. And the thought there is that it would help ease the demand for gasoline by reducing, I guess it would actually increase the efficiency, right? That's a more efficient speed limit than being able to go faster. And once again, they held federal funds over the heads of the state and said that if you do not comply, then you will lose money. Another one was motorcycle helmets in 1975. So it was very similar to that, where where states were being forced to make motorcyclists wear motorcycle helmets. I think at this point, only 3 states are not forcing people to comply, but that one was in 1975. And the most recent one was actually in 2009. Now, it did not pass. This one was actually introduced in 2009, and it was texting while driving. They wanted to make that a federal regulation. Now, whether or not you believe in texting while driving, most people don't, right? But at the same time, too, though, is that the thought was that if you do not make this a statewide law, that we will reduce your funding by 25%. Now, again, that one didn't pass. That one was about 12 years ago or so. But that one actually did not. That one did not pass. So these are all examples of when we're looking at infrastructure bills, how the federal government will actually withhold this funding from individual states unless they comply with the federal regulations. So my guess is, and what you're going to see with this, is you are going to see some of this stuff sneak back in, right? If you listen to the $2 trillion episode, we talked about how they were making stuff with EVs, electric vehicles, charging stations, things along those lines. And so as the federal government will push this national agenda, whether it's the Green New Deal or whatever else it might be, you will start to see this type of funding, my guess is anyway, this type of funding that would normally go to the states will be withheld if these states do not comply. And as we have seen, a lot of state funding is from the federal government, and the state governments are commonly had funding in the past, and there are examples where the federal government is withholding this money from them. So I thought it was super interesting. I was pretty unaware of a lot of this stuff, and so like I said, I wanted to start by looking at the new infrastructure bill, where it's allocated to. I thought the part about how they thought that it was going to cut the national debt, the U.S. debt, was very interesting. And then I really kind of started to go down the rabbit hole as far as the federal funding goes. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed the show. I hope you got a lot out of it. I hope you learned something. I know I did whenever I was kind of doing the research on it. And as normally, I'll go ahead and I'll post the articles too for in the show notes page. And so that way, if you're curious to go and read it, which I always encourage, you can also go and do that. But if you got some value out of it, share the show. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you'll share it with somebody else that will learn something as well. And that's it for the show this week, and we will talk to you soon. All right, bye.